Here, the UK government has set out a new definition of extremism. It's part of its promise to tackle what it says is an increased threat since the Hamas attacks in Israel last October. The intention is to stop groups or individuals from having a platform to spread incendiary views. But concerns have been raised that any definition could be seen as unfair and undemocratic. With more details on what was said, here's our political correspondent, Peter Soul.
This has become a regular sight at weekends in our cities. Thousands of people taking to the streets in protest at Israel's actions in Gaza. The current conflict in the Middle East has prompted a political debate, not just about the fighting there, but about the impact on community cohesion here.
In recent weeks and months, we have seen a shocking increase in extremist disruption and criminality.
In a surprise speech on Downing Street 2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister warned that extremists were trying to tear us apart. But who exactly are these so-called extremists? Well, today the government has published a new definition of extremism. It's described as the promotion or advancement of an ideology based on violence, hatred or intolerance that aims to negate or destroy the fundamental rights and freedoms of others and undermine the UK's system of democracy and democratic rights, or intentionally create a permissive environment for others to do that. It's the brainchild of the Communities Secretary. Michael Gove told the Commons that groups that fall foul of the term will, in effect, be blacklisted, excluded from government meetings and funding.
We are in no way intending to restrict freedom of expression, religion or belief. But the government cannot be in a position where, unwittingly or not, we sponsor, subsidise or support in any way organisations and individuals opposed to the freedoms we hold dear.
He proceeded to name some of those organisations.
The British National Socialist Movement and Patriotic Alternative, who promote neo-Nazi ideology, argue for forced repatriation, a white ethno-state and the targeting of minority groups for intimidation, are precisely the type of groups about which we should be concerned and whose activities we will assess against the new definition.
And he also said some Muslim groups gave rise to concern. Labour, though, want more.
Today's statement does not go far enough, and regardless of how workable and effective this new definition and centre of excellence is, this announcement will not be enough.
And some organisations already feel got at.
Communities are very concerned at this time as to how the government is going to apply this consistently and equally, given that it's not a legal definition, but one that they have arbitrary power to choose.
All of this is pretty fundamental to our democracy. We expect our politicians to defend people's right to speak out, no matter how unpalatable their views might be. But we also expect them to protect the values that most of us hold dear. Those currently in power hope that they've struck the right balance. Peter Soul, BBC News.
Well, to get more reaction to that story, we can go now to Brendan Cox. Now, Brendan Cox co-founded the organisation Survivors Against Terror. That was, of course, after his wife, the Labour MP Jo Cox, was murdered by a far-right extremist in 2016. Welcome to BBC News, Mr Cox. First of all, I'd like to get your reaction to what we heard from Michael Gove today.
I think it's good that the government are talking about extremism. Post the 7th of October, there's been a real upsurge both in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and that's making British citizens feel less safe on our streets. So we have to do something about it. The question really is, how do we do that? And for me, there's two critical things that we need if we're going to defeat extremism. The first is that we need there to be a political consensus around what extremism is, what our strategy is. And I think in recent weeks, we really undermine that by the way that this has been briefed, the politics around it. And then secondly, it has to stand the test of time. We have to have a consistent approach. The extremists who try to undermine our system of government, who try to undermine our democracy, our fundamental values, have got a long-term strategy. They've got a 10, 20, 30-year strategy. And if every general election this changes, it changes with the tide of politics, we are going to be less effective. So I think addressing extremism is obviously, the people that I work with day in, day out at Survivors Against Terror, people who have been killed by Islamist extremists, by far-right extremists, by Irish Republican extremists and others. They want nothing more than a serious and credible attempt to defeat extremism. But what they definitely don't want is people who are willing to play politics with what should be a really important and an area of consensus within the country.
Just to be direct then, are you saying that the government is playing politics at the moment?
I think the way that this process has been done has divided us rather than united us. I mean, what's happened in the recent weeks is you've got everybody from the Archbishop of Canterbury through to MPs out on the far right of the Conservative Party. You've had 3 former Home Secretaries, former head of counter-terrorism policing, former head of the armed services, all saying that this has to be an area of consensus. As soon as we divide our communities and our country on this issue, it makes us vulnerable. And I think that is what happened. Now, whether that's because of the electoral timescale, the fact that this is being announced in the run-up to an election, I think should concern us. But whatever happens, in terms of what happens next, the critical thing is that that consensus is built. So I think if the Prime Minister, of Michael Gove and others are serious about really gripping this extremist threat, what they should be doing is sitting down with communities, with faith leaders, as the Archbishop of Canterbury has offered, and with different political parties to make sure this is a strategy that unites us and brings us together rather than one that weakens us.
Do you think it was necessary to have a redefinition in the first place of what constitutes extremism? I mean, you're someone who works at the coalface when it comes to this issue.
I think extremism is always, when it's non-violent extremism, is always hard to define, because the risk is that you capture people, capture organisations who you might fundamentally disagree with, but aren't necessarily violent jihadis or violent far-right people. And there's a risk, as you were talking about in the package, of undermining some of our democratic values. And in the past, people like the suffragettes might have been named extremists. You might have had people who are campaigning against South African apartheid in very angry and noisy ways be labelled as some as extremists. You might have current Tory donors named as extremists. So how you do that definition needs to be sensible, needs to be careful, and it needs to be something that takes different communities and different people from different political backgrounds with it. And this, therefore, I think, I don't have a major problem with each of the words used in this definition, but I do have a major problem with the way that this process has been botched, and it's ended up with us being more divided as a country.
I was just reading something that you posted on X, which I just wanted to briefly ask you about, following up on that point. You said it could risk looking like an ideological stooge of whoever is in power, it being the body that decides which groups may or may not be on that list. What is the way forward if it's not having this body that draws up that list?
So I welcome the idea of creating a centre of excellence to combat extremism. The key thing is that it is actually a centre of excellence, and it's not just some civil servants that work for a minister and are appointable and are accountable to him. If we end up with that, we'll end up essentially with a minister drawing up a list over their cornflakes in the morning of organisations they don't like and rubber stamping that. And that is a completely unacceptable way for us to go about what's an incredibly serious set of issues. And you've seen already this happening, the briefing to the papers, the list of organisations that have been briefed in some of that aren't extremist organisations. They're organisations that the government might not like, but they're not extremist organisations. The list that Michael Gove gave today was much shorter, much tighter, and I think that was on advisement that the list that they had been briefing simply didn't reach a decent threshold. So that centre is important. I think it could provide great insight, but in order to do that, it needs to be independent. It needs to have independent oversight. It can't just be a part of the civil service reporting into the minister. And for Conservative members of Parliament who are thinking about this and who might like Michael Gove's view, I think they also have to ask themselves the question, if there's an election in a few months' time and the Labour Party wins and Angela Rayner is the person that is signing up that list and overseeing that centre of expertise on extremism, will they be as comfortable?